Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Bond, Schoeneck King Special Education webinar for the winter of 2025. My name is Jeffrey Weiss, and I am here to introduce everybody for our program. It's a very important and always timely program, tips and suggestions to avoid impartial hearing requests. Joined today, we have an all-star statewide panel of special education attorneys with considerable experience on many of the issues that we're here to discuss today. My name is Jeffrey Weiss. I'm in Bond, Schoeneck & King's Buffalo office. I'm joined with three of my colleagues. Also in the Buffalo office is my colleague Andrew Mark. And in our Rochester office, we have Ann McGinnis and Katie Stifler, and we all focus quite a bit on special education law, representing school districts. And we're here today to go through 22 tips and suggestions to avoid impartial hearing requests. So the key here is practical guidance and suggestions to avoid parents becoming frustrated, bringing claims against school district with respect to special education matters. So I just want to say at the outset, the purpose is not to focus 100% on legal compliance. That might be another webinar, top 100, top 22 legal mistakes that school districts make. Our focus today is on what to do to avoid parents becoming upset and bringing hearing requests. There is quite a bit of overlap between the legal requirements and those practical considerations, but we're going to come at it today based on our experience from the circumstances that prompt parents to bring claims and what we could do to avoid them. So, we're going to try to make this informal and conversational. And if someone has questions, feel free to enter them in the chat or the Q&A on your webinar screen, and we'll try to get to them. We want to make this informal. We'll be going from 9 o'clock to 10:30, so we have a lot to cover, and let's get it started. So let's go with tip number one.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm starting us off with tip number one, and that is invest in reading programs, services, and training so that your district will have alternative ways to address reading-based needs when they arise. And in special education due process, you see trends over time. And one trend that's been here for a long time is reading. And parents initiating due process complaints against districts because they do not believe that the district's IEP appropriately addressed their child's reading needs. Sometimes we see that claim being around a request for specialized reading on the IEP, or for compensatory services for reading, or even for tuition at private school placements for schools that may specialize in reading instruction. This is a big topic, but one suggestion that I have is to be sure that your team is fully trained on some best practices in reading, so that if an issue arises where a student has a reading disability like dyslexia, we have a team that is ready to be able to address that. Now, the most important piece of that is that the IEP identifies the needs and the goals address the needs. From there, our team, our instructional staff, takes that and implements the instruction the student needs. But they need the tools to be able to do that. And there's a lot of different programs out there. It's not required that you use any certain type of program, but thinking ahead can help prevent an issue from arising later if a parent makes an argument that we did not appropriately address their child's reading needs. Anybody else have anything to share on that?
Yeah, thanks, Ann. So, from a practical standpoint, as Ann said, the parent's not entitled to a specific reading program. We pick the methodology, And if we have one and only one reading program at our disposal, and the program is not working, students not making progress, the variables we see are frequency and duration, so and group size too. So if you only have one program and the student's not doing well, what we see is, maybe the student would get reading instruction 3 times a week. Well, let's increase that to 5. Or maybe the student was in a class of 15 kids for reading, or 10 kids, or 5, and we decrease it, smaller group size. And most of the time that might work. But when it doesn't work, when we run out of, we can't make it any smaller, and we can't give more frequent. If we can't make it any more frequent, then all we can do at that point, perhaps, is look for another program. And again, this is a last ditch resort at times, but we see that the schools that do invest in reading and have lots of teachers trained and have multiple programs at their disposal, they don't get to that last resort, or they don't run out of options, and they can keep working with parents, and they can problem solve. So that's what I see. Anyone else?
Just a little tip that I also want to share. I see that a lot of districts provide reading programs to students through their building level services, because they say that every student has access to reading intervention if they need it. And that makes sense from a practical perspective, but from a legal perspective, if a student requires specialized reading due to their disability, it's imperative that you include that specialized reading on the student's IEP as a service, and that service includes the frequency, duration, and ratio, and that you have an IEP goal or more than one IEP goal to be addressed through that. We don't get credit at due process if it doesn't make it to the IEP.
Okay. Well, then let's move to number 2. Tip number 2, which again, we put the big ones at the top because might as well. They're not in any particular order, but we put the most common themes we see. We wanted to put that at the start. Well, we have your attention. So tip number 2, recognize RTI. There's an overuse of RTI at times. RTI is only legally required for students in kindergarten through 4th grade suspected of having a learning disability in reading. Those are the only kids that we have to go through RTI before classifying them as learning disabled. So there's 2 things here. First is we need to make sure that our RTI process for those kids, K through 4 reading, is a really good process that's working and successful and appropriate, and actually has distinctive tiers, and kids are moving up and down as needed, and we're monitoring them. We shouldn't have kids in RTI for forever. They shouldn't be stuck somewhere. And we must make sure that, well, let me put it this way. What we've seen, like, coming out of COVID, is some districts' RTI programs have sort of become a secondary priority, and maybe they've gone to the building level, and there hasn't been as much oversight from the school districts, the CSC people. And I think it's worth take a look at what's going on in your RTI programs, and are they clear? Are they precise? Are there criteria to go from one tier to the next? Are we paying attention closely and focusing on what the students are getting, what their needs? And there should be 3 tiers in RTI, but it's really 2 tiers, because tier one is everybody. The curriculum, generalized curriculum is tier one. Kids who need to go through the RTI process, there should be at least 2 concrete, distinct tiers based on frequency, duration, and group size. Some schools I've seen maybe only have 1 tier at this point, and it's not, or they have 2 and they're sort of combined. Take a look, make sure they're clear, make sure you have some sort of structure, and make sure you have some sort of guidelines as to how long you want a student to be in one tier before going to the next. Take a look. I suspect when RTI first came out, when they amended the IDEA and the Part 200 regs with the LD requirements, this was a big focus of school districts, but that was probably more than 10 years ago. Make sure you have that it's getting the proper attention. It's clear, it's precise, it's being taken care of, and make sure it's working. If your RTI programs, one of the criteria for RTI is you're supposed to monitor if your approaches are successful. And if they're not, we should come up with more approaches. Because what we're seeing is some kids, K-4, suspected of learning disability in reading, are just getting lost in the crack, falling through the cracks. They go there and they stay there forever. And what the claims these lead to, by the way, are failure to classify. You'll have a student in RTI for 4 years, and the parent said, "Where was my IEP?" And in hindsight, sometimes we look back and go, they didn't go through. They're supposed to go through there's recommendations, and this isn't legal, but comes from state guidance and experts in the field, that they want to see a number of weeks in tier 2 and then a number of weeks in tier 3. And that needs to be monitored so that the kids are going through RTI. And if they're not making sufficient progress, they should be referred to the CSC. Again, those are for the kids who are suspected of learning disability in reading, K-4. The other angle where we get into hot water is we're using RTI for kids not suspected of a learning disability in reading or not in grades K-4. Like we're using RTI for kids suspected of behavioral disabilities or OHI or speech issues. And while the law kind of says that we could do some RTI for those type of kids, if they're meeting the criteria for eligibility for a classification, and we're coming up with some RTI approach that meets their needs, and that approach really closely resembles special education and the services that we get in an IEP, then we haven't classified them, and we'll get a failure to classify claim. So again, there's two distinct issues. It's the kids who should be in RTI, K-4 reading, are just getting stuck there forever, and overuse of RTI for the other groups. And again, what's the big deal? What if we're meeting their needs in RTI? Well, the parents will argue that they're denied, since their child isn't classified, they're denied all the procedural rights that they should be afforded through the CSC process. So take a look at your practices. If it's on the school building level, meet with your school building staff and ask, what are you guys doing in RTI, and is it looking legally compliant? Sorry I went on so much, but this is a big issue that we're seeing, and it's actually becoming a bigger issue as we're moving away from COVID.
Yeah, I just have some other things to share. It's all about child find. And Child Find under the IDEA is our duty to locate, evaluate, and identify students with qualifying disabilities who are district residents. And using RTI or MTSS, these pre-referral building level interventions, it's a good instructional practice, but we have to closely monitor on an individual student basis, like Jeff said, and make sure we refer to the CSE when a student is in this for a certain period of time and not making adequate progress and has exhausted all of the tiers, or the student demonstrates a need for this level of intervention to continue to make progress over time. That both of those situations are an indication that there could be an underlying disability and we should refer to the CSE. There was a question about how long students should be in the different tiers. We can't give you a concrete answer on that, but there are some case law decisions that say several months is too long. So I can say if a student is at a very intense tier for over a year, that's too long. That student should be referred to CSE. But it is an individual student determination, and it should be based on the RTI or MTSS team developing a goal for that student within that tier and collecting data towards that student's progress for that goal to identify if the student has achieved it. And if the student doesn't achieve it within the identified time that the team determines, then we go to the next tier and we continue that process until we've exhausted the tiers and have evidence that the student has not met the goals. We had a couple of questions about reading that I just wanted to touch on really quickly. One question is it advised that the district's special education teachers are trained in different reading interventions and programs than reading interventionists, so that the special education services and programs being implemented are different than what's provided through intervention? Well, under the law, specialized reading can be implemented on an IEP by a reading specialist, somebody certified in reading, or a certified special education teacher. So yeah, the more teachers that you can train and have ready to address this, the better you'll be able to address student needs. As far as it looking different, I don't know necessarily that it needs to look different. When it's done through an IEP, it's based on what's on the student's IEP goals and the interventions that need to be addressed that way. Another question is, some parents have requested one-to-one reading instruction. Is this violating FAPE? Our district provides small group 5 times weekly with a certified reading teacher. So no, one-on-one reading instruction does not violate a FAPE. And there are students with significant reading needs who require one-to-one reading instruction. And there's a lot of case law around that. So it's important that we individualize the recommendation based on the severity of the student need. So we need to avoid saying like, well, we have a group that meets every day and that's what we have. That might be great for a lot of kids, but other kids might need a 2-to-1 or a 1-to-1, or they might need a longer period of reading instruction or 2 periods of reading instruction a day. It needs to be individualized for those students.
And can I, just following up, in terms of how long should the RTI process be? And as you and I said, there's nothing in the regs or the law that says how long they should be, but there's guidance documents out there on that. I recall that if most of the recommendations for tier 2 and tier 3, if you add them up, they were beyond 40 weeks, which to me means you should never classify a kindergarten student as learning disabled in reading, because 40 weeks is a school year. So there might be an example here or there, but that would be a potential argument that we're
Yeah.
classifying too soon.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So I think that a lot of school psychologists, including myself, have been trained that we're really not looking at specific learning disabilities before age 7, because it could be developmental, just neurologically, that it might not be an underlying learning disability. And that's an area where the law doesn't always align with what we know as best practice. So we know as best practice that some of those littler kids need more time. And absolutely, I think classifying as LD in kindergarten is very unusual. Um, but there are some cases out there that say that we should be classifying as soon as first grade. We're not advising that you do that necessarily. We're just throwing that out there, that sometimes the legal analysis does not align with what we know as best practice for student development. We have a good question here. Do you see RTI and MTSS as two different systems? Also wondering about tier one instruction being strong enough to support most students. So RTI and my understanding, I think different people have different definitions, but my definition is RTI is a tiered system of support for academics, and MTSS is broader than that and includes things like behavior and social emotional needs, but still the same underlying concept of a tiered system of support with empirically based interventions, data driven towards goals to see how students are making progress. Yeah, I do think that tier one instruction is a really important consideration. If you have a high number of students who are not meeting grade level standards and are needing RTI or MTSS, that is a sign that we need to revisit tier one instruction and see if there's training and programs that we can put in place to try to prevent students from having to go into those tiered levels by meeting their needs in that first tier. Another question, are there recommendations for reading programs? Not necessarily, but I will say if a student has dyslexia, so dyslexia is typically defined as difficulties with reading fluency and decoding. We want some kind of Orton Gillingham based program or a similar idea as Orton Gillingham that breaks down the components of reading into very explicit, systematic, usually multi-sensory instruction. We have a lot of research that for students with that dyslexia profile, that's the type of intervention they need. Obviously, it's an individual student decision, but I still see districts that don't have that systematic, explicit, multi-sensory approach to reading instruction. They just don't offer it. They're still using more of a whole language approach. Whole language works for a lot of kids, but we always have that subset of kids that need something that is more systematic and explicit.
All right.
There's
All right.
more, but
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to move on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And just by the way, after the program, we'll be circulating the slides and a recording. I know there's a question about copies of the slides, so they'll be forthcoming. Okay, tip number 3.
All right, good morning, everyone, and apologies in advance for my voice as I battle the latest bug to come through the Rochester area. So tip number 3 is that when a student's program is adversely impacted by a staff shortage, for example, the district doesn't have an occupational therapist to provide OT services per the student's IEP, or the district is unable to secure an out-of-district placement, so the student is then provided with home instruction, the district should regularly update the parent on its efforts to address the situation. So we're aware that staffing shortages are affecting everybody in New York State. There aren't enough aides, there aren't enough support staff or programs. And we know that while we're searching for staff in appropriate programs, we may have students who are in a program or receiving services that might not be the most appropriate. So we understand this is hard. This is a difficult situation for districts. What we want to emphasize with this slide is that this is also a difficult situation for parents as well. And what we can do is stay in close communication with parents. So what we're seeing is that parents are more likely to initiate due process when a long period of time has gone by with no update. They haven't heard from the district about any progress or what's going on. They feel generally just out of the loop. So one suggestion is you could put on your calendar a reminder, right, to provide regular updates to parents and families, give them some information about what the district has been doing to try to address the situation in the meantime. This isn't a legal requirement. There's nothing in the regs that says you have to provide parents and families with regular updates, but it's more of a practical suggestion about how to maintain a relationship with parents, right? These are people who you're going to be working with for years a lot of times. So it can be important to maintain that relationship with them, but that has an added bonus of potentially avoiding, parents initiating due process when they feel that they're included and they're in the loop and they're updated on what the district is doing to address the situation.
Thank you. And my only follow-up is if parents become increasing amount of upset, remember, you be proactive and say, we will make things up. We will make the student whole. Recognize we're in a vulnerable situation because we're not implementing the IEP. and start thinking about proactively resolving potential claims by getting ahead of it. All right, thank you. On a related note, tip number 4.
Very closely related.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. So, great points made by Katie. So you have your efforts to maintain the relationship on the parent side, and sort of behind the scenes, the purpose of this slide, invest time and resources to staffing and placement shortages, sort of describes and has to do with what our efforts are to avoid as best we can, or do whatever we can to avoid situations where we don't have a placement. Now, we completely understand the practical realities of just what the landscape is right now, and nobody is saying that you have to get blood from a stone, but I think the emphasis here is, one email to placements at the beginning of the year and say, well, nothing's available is not going to look very good, when we're at a due process hearing. So, obviously we want to avoid that in the first place, by helping the parent understand, regularly communicating, but, what our efforts are to find those, placements by, recruiting and employee retention, building those strong relationships with other agencies. Maybe you have that personal connection where, you can reach out to that person and they can do you a solid. Maybe, political outreach. If you're not doing any efforts in there, that's something to consider, to ensure that there are sufficient amount of out-of-district placements. We've heard anecdotally that, one of the perhaps unanticipated consequences of the ruling of FAPE 22 is that in these out-of-district placements, openings that were otherwise created by students turning 21 and exiting are now being filled longer. So there are less, there's less turnover for newer students as older students remain in those programs. Perhaps Albany may not be aware of that. So, if there are things, people that you can reach out to perhaps put a little pressure on to say, hey, this is what's going on, or, other, maybe they want to take a look at the regulatory process for, what it's like to get a placement or a program approved so that there are more options to place students. But we need to be doing something is really the point of this slide. At a minimum, like I mentioned, we would at least have a better defense to say, we did A, B, C, D, E, and F, and we still came up short, as we're sitting in a due process hearing. At least to some degree, we're, mitigating our damages, for lack of a better phrase. But, you have to deal with the parent side, but also be making efforts, as best you can, as best we can in this reality to find those placements.
Thank you. All right, we're moving and grooving now. Tip number 5.
Okay, tip number 5. Coordinate with school building administrators to ensure that all school removals, which include but aren't limited to formal suspensions, are accurately tracked throughout the school year so that pattern determinations, and by extension, manifestation determination review meetings, are conducted when legally required. We wanted to provide a reminder for you all that if a student has been suspended or removed for more than 10 non-consecutive days in a school year, so more than 10 cumulative days in a school year, then we can't further suspend or remove that student without conducting a pattern determination, right? And if we determine that there is a pattern, then we're, of course, moving to the manifestation determination. Also, if a student is removed for disciplinary purposes, so not just out of school suspension, that removal can count toward the 10 days. So it's really important for building administrators to be communicating these removals to the CSE so that the CSE knows when that threshold 10 days has been met and can conduct the required pattern determination. So the risk here is that if there's no communication between the building administrators and the CSE, we risk not conducting a legally required pattern determination, which is likely to be raised if the parent does bring a due process complaint.
Yeah, what we see, it kind of, when we came up with these slides, candidly, we were saying, what slide should we put for discipline? And obviously, we can't put, never discipline a student with a disability. That wouldn't be a practical tip. But this is, it's this internal counting, which sometimes falls, slips through the cracks. One of the most common situations we see are the unofficial removals, the regular phone calls from the principal to home saying, hey, Johnny's having a bad day. Why don't you just come and pick him up? And they don't really track that. That doesn't count as a removal, but in the parent's eyes, this is a removal, because when the principal calls and says, pick up your child, you're going to pick them up. That might happen 10 times in a year. Then you add on 5 or 6 formal suspensions. You're way past 10 at that point, and you haven't had a pattern determination. And we see that exact fact pattern comes up. I see that one a couple of times each year. So just coordinate that, remind your staff, and just keep track of all this. But this is by far the biggest tip to avoid litigation within reason for these type of claims.
Yes, can I just share a little more
Sure.
with that, Jeff?
Sure,
So
sure.
I just want to share that there really is nothing in the law that lets us call up a parent and say, Johnny's having a bad day, why don't you come get him? I understand that that is a supportive way to try to address a student's needs. We don't want to suspend a student, but the law says if we're sending a student home, it has to be a suspension. If we're sending them home for disciplinary reasons, essentially reasons other than being ill in school. Other ways that kids are removed are through in-school suspension if they're not receiving all of their IEP services while they're in school suspension. Really, if a student is out of their program or their class for discipline purposes, that counts as a removal. And the regs say a partial day counts as a full day, and the regs do not define a partial day. So I get questions, what about 5 minutes? What about an hour? Well, if it's a partial day under the regs, that's a full day. It has to count towards those 10 days. And the state is, due to disproportionality, really monitoring this for a lot of you right now. It is unpleasant if you're not being monitored. Try to do the best you can to not find yourself in a situation where you will be monitored. And the state is saying that this pattern determination process needs to happen before we can remove the student anytime we get beyond 10 days. And if there's a pattern, the state is saying that we're supposed to hold the manifestation before we can remove the student. So a lot of procedural requirements that are very confusing around that.
And 2 questions. Is a partial day, does that still count as a full day for purposes of pattern determinations?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
And we don't have the definition of a partial day. So take that as you will.
There's no math right? Also, how would you recommend building administrators document unofficial removals?
I would recommend that building administrators do not do unofficial removals. That's what I would recommend, and that they understand that that is not a thing, and that there are commissioners' decisions on that that say that we have to process it in accordance with our code of conduct. And if they do still do that despite our recommendations, I don't know, you guys have to find a way where they're letting CSE know and that you guys are documenting it through your student information system or student referrals or something like that.
Here's a question. I don't know if it's a trick question. Did I just see it was, wait.
Was it the 10 days start over?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Sorry, I'm
Okay.
clicking as we go.
Yeah, okay. So, Anne, I don't know if I handle the myth of the starting over.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thanks for asking them. So
Yeah.
one of them is, once we get to the 10 days, does it start over? No, it does not. It doesn't start over until the school year ends. So that goes from July 1st through June 30th. You get 10 free days in a school year. Use them wisely. Once you get beyond that, every time you're going to be disciplining the student, you have to do that pattern determination. And if there's a pattern, a manifestation determination, if it counts as a removal or a suspension, you have to do that. And you can see how a pattern might emerge. So maybe the first time you do the pattern, there's no pattern, but maybe over time, there might start to be a pattern which would require a manifestation determination, but it does not start over.
All right. Tip number 6.
Unmute myself. I'm becoming a boomer very quickly. Sorry. All right. So number 6, when placing a student in an out-of-district program, invite a representative from that program to the CSE meeting. All right. So there's 2 reasons why we do this. The first one is a good one. It's legally required. So that's right in the regulations. You are obligated to invite a representative from an out-of-district program when you're considering recommending that program. The second one, which is why we're here to avoid impartial hearings, is really probably the purpose of the rule, and really for our purposes, is having that representative from that program is that person is there to provide information about that program. And from a practical standpoint, what we're hoping for is that they can put the parent's mind at ease, and be there to provide information about the program and lead that parent to the conclusion that the program that we're recommending is appropriate. Because if that person is not there and the parent's left in the dark and feeling uneasy about that recommendation, I mean, it's not hard to get, it's not hard to see how a parent like that, confused and not really sure about this, would file a due process complaint. So that's really the long and short of this one. And I guess also from a practical standpoint too, if we don't have a representative there and the parent hires an attorney to file the complaint, and that's a low-hanging fruit claim that the attorney can just put right in, and there's almost no defense, if we don't comply with that. So if they can't be there in person, then make arrangements for that individual to participate remotely or by telephone, but have that person at that meeting.
Excellent, excellent, excellent tip. Okay, number 7. Number 7. Okay, which is me. Take steps to convince parents to attend CSE meetings, especially when the CSE is likely to make significant changes to the student's IEP. So, kind of taking a step backwards, legally, this is a huge procedural requirement. So if we do get a claim and the parent's not there, it's always hard to prevail under that circumstance. And the legal standard to show the efforts to get a parent to attend are lofty. Multiple attempts, visits to their house, visits to their workplace. That's not me, that's the state guidance on this. So again, we're in potential legal jeopardy if the parent doesn't attend. But from a practical standpoint, we know parents don't go to all CSE meetings. But notice in this tip, we put especially when the CSE is likely to make significant changes to the student's IEP. If we're changing the student's placement, maybe out of the district, and the parent's not there at the meeting, and the first time they hear about it is in a letter, the odds of them getting upset are much greater than when they're there in person and we can explain to them the rationale for this and why this is a good idea. This tip goes hand in hand with the previous tip. This is why we want them at the meeting, because we need to get ahead of the parents' upset by comforting them, addressing their concerns. Maybe we could come up with an amendment or a change or additional service that would ease the parents' concerns. But if the parent's not there and big stuff is happening, again, not only are we legally in hot water, but I think we're playing with fire in terms of a parent getting upset and bringing a claim. Okay. Number 8.
Number 8 is fairly straightforward. Over reliance on pre-CSE meetings, the parent must be heard at the CSE meeting. So parent participation at the CSE meeting is arguably the most important procedural rule that we have to make sure we follow in the CSE process. And it is permissible to have pre-CSE meetings. That's allowed. But we have to take care that they're not so detailed and so comprehensive that it essentially takes the place of the CSE. That can look a lot like predetermination. So I've been involved in situations where parents have gone to pre-CSE meetings and they've said, I don't have to go to the CSE. We already talked about everything. That's a sign that you did way too much at the pre-CSE meeting. So a pre-CSE meeting is a good place to really thoroughly review any evaluations and PLEPs, maybe talk about some goals, but we have to be sure that we let the parent know that all final decisions will be made at CSE and that we still cover all of those legally required components at the actual CSE meeting.
Okay. We're moving and grooving to tip number 9. Here is another tip. We're seeing a trend here. Now getting into the tips that are legal requirements that will actually help avoid claims. So regularly update IEP PLEPs. That's the present level of educational performance section in the IEP and the statements of need. Now the PLEPs are the most important. The PLEPs are the most important section in the IEP because they lead to the needs, which lead to the goals, which lead to the services, and so on. Your PLEPs are the first domino. If that domino is off, everything else is going to be off. So you need to regularly update them. If the PLEPs from a 2nd grader shouldn't be the same as a 5th grader or an 8th grader or a 10th grader. You need to be based on the current needs. PLEPs, the P is present. We need the current needs in there. Again, that's why we evaluate. That's why we have people at these meetings. That's why we review data to make the IEP current. Plus, now why is that important from a practical standpoint? It's going to show the parent that we're paying attention. It's going to give them confidence that we are focusing on the student's needs. It's going to assure the parent that we're listening to their input, that we have a document that's evolving and dynamic and narrowly tailored to address the student's current needs. It's a document that we could be proud of and we could be confident in when we defend it. And by the way, it's hard to do this. This takes a lot of work. You have to remove, I'm not a big fan of, some schools never take stuff out of the PLEPs. They just keep adding new stuff and new stuff and new stuff. And you have this monster document and you start looking and it starts with things that were present many years ago. Take stuff out, put stuff in, make it alive and current, and make sure that we're getting input from the parent into the PLEPs. They'll get more buy-in that way. They'll feel like they're more part of the team. In addition to there is a legal requirement to get the parent voice into the document, but this is a very important and an underrated tip that goes to the underlying relationship between the parent and the district to show that we're listening to you, we're focusing on the current needs, and we're going to meet those needs and we're going to get progress. Okay. Anyone have any thoughts on that before we go to 10? All right. Now we're going to go to tip number 10.
Okay, number 10, develop annual IEP goals that focus on the skills necessary for the student to master the curriculum, as opposed to simply basing progress on whether the student passes a class or an exam. So a few things. IEP goals. And progress toward IEP goals is arguably the most important part of building a defense if a parent alleges that we denied their child a free, appropriate public education. The IEP goals flow from the identified needs and the present levels of performance. So we need to take care and prioritize which needs are included in those PLEPs so that we have corresponding goals around that. The goals have to be individualized, measurable for the student, and they're supposed to be based on the curriculum. They should not be grade level goals though. If we assume that a child can be achieving at grade level at the end of the year, they don't need a goal around that. They're making progress as expected in the curriculum. But we should think about what the expectations are in the curriculum and develop goals to help the student be able to reach those expectations. So for example, if by the end of the year, we expect students to write 5-paragraph essays with an opening paragraph, 3 supporting paragraphs, and a closing paragraph, maybe using that standard in the curriculum for a student with a writing need could be that the student writes 1 paragraph with 5 sentences, an opening, 3 supporting sentences, and a closing sentence. So we can use the curriculum to inform the goals, not grade level goals. And then we need to take data towards those goals to assist us with identifying if the student is making progress or if something needs to be changed to ensure that the student makes progress, either the amount of service or something like that. Should we go to the next one?
Actually, and I have someone asked a very good question. Just curious of people's thoughts. I never heard this question posed before. When you have a program review meeting, so it's not an annual review, it's a program review, do you update the PLEPs? And my take on it is certainly no prohibition against doing that. And if a need arises, I would be for it. If something is no longer present, if there's a new need. But that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I don't think there's a requirement that you update the PLEPs unless something's discussed at the program review that would warrant updating them. We absolutely have to redo the PLEPs every year at the annual. A program review, there might be something that comes up where we update a section of it, but you don't have to go through and update everything.
Right.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's could always comes down to could, should, and must. But that was an interesting angle. Okay, tip number 11.
Okay, tip number 11. When a parent disagrees with the CSE's recommendation at a CSE meeting, the chairperson should clearly explain to the parent, A, that the committee has considered his or her input, and B, the basis for the CSE's recommendation. Sounds very simple. So we know that parents have a right to meaningful participation in the IEP development process. Everybody's doing that, I presume. Now, when a parent disagrees with the CSE's recommendation, the parent doesn't have veto power. Okay, so in some cases, the parent's not going to be happy with the placement recommendation, at least maybe not initially. But when the parent is in disagreement, right, the likelihood of a hearing request is already heightened to some degree, right? So this is where, we want to get in front of it as best we can, handhold a little bit and explain, make it clear that, whatever the request has been considered, and explain why maybe that specific reading program that they're looking for is not necessarily the only appropriate, only appropriate methodology. Explain why that is, what are the similarities. But the parent is obviously an important part of the process. So we want to make sure that we're very clearly communicating that we are considering their requests, we're considering their input, and of course document that. Because if they feel like they're heard, perhaps they're less likely to bring a complaint. I mean, that's maybe true in any disagreement when the other person at least feels like their perspective is being considered. It tends to diffuse things, maybe not always, but responding with general statements like "we don't do that here," in response to a request is, that's not going to look good for us. Even if it's true, that we don't want to say that. We want to say something along the lines of, we've considered that, but here's why we're moving in a different direction. General statements like, we don't do that here. They tend to alienate. They're dismissive, and it signals that you're not considering the parent's input. It could also lead to a claim of predetermination. So we want to be careful to avoid statements like that. Anyone else?
Yes. Sorry, there's a little
Yeah, sure.
typo in that sentence with the bullet. It's missing a couple of words. So it's interesting. So there are chairpersons who some will go through an entire career and never have a disagreement with a parent. Is that something they'll never have to look across the table and say, well, we disagree. And there's nothing you can do at that point to avoid an impartial hearing. But just to kind of reiterate that, the parent does not have the right to veto the decision or block it. If there's a disagreement, it's up to the chairperson. And those are tough situations, but make sure your responses are individualized. Okay. Anything else? Or are we on to the next one?
No, but I did see a question about, is it also legally required for an outside representative to be at a CPSE meeting? So the CPSE regs, when it comes to recommendations like that, say they have to be made in accordance with 200. Sorry, I'm going to put my nerd self on 200.4, D4, and basically what that says is yes. So it tracks the same regulations. So the answer to that question is yes. Have an outside representative present at the CPSE meeting.
Yeah, and the outside representative, if people have never heard of that before, that rule is not found in the, you said it was 200.4, I think. That one falls through the cracks because it's not listed under the section that lists the CSE members.
Right.
It's a few pages down in another section. That's why it's so important. Okay, tip number 12.
All right, tip 12 is develop measurable IEP goals so that parents and staff are able to understand how the student's progress will be monitored. So when we identify a goal for the student, it's really important for that goal to be both measurable and observable so that it's clear from the way that goal is written in the IEP what criteria the student is expected to meet to achieve that goal. One good way to think about it could a parent who has no background in education, maybe this is their first experience with the CSE, can they pick up that IEP and understand what the goal is and how progress toward that goal is going to be monitored? Anne mentioned earlier that clear and concise, goals and documenting progress toward those goals can become especially helpful in defense to a claim that we haven't provided FAPE. So clear and concise goals are not only helpful for parents to be able to understand the goals and the criteria, but also makes it easier for the district to be able to understand those goals as well and document the students' progress toward meeting those goals.
Excellent. And it's easier said than done to draft measurable goals. Very difficult. Takes a lot of time. Okay. We're moving. We're 10 more. We're doing great. Tip number 13.
Okay, tip number 13, recommend parent counseling and training when legally required. All right, so parent counseling and training as defined by the regulations is assisting parents in understanding the special needs of their child, providing parents with information about child development, and helping parents to acquire the necessary skills that will allow them to support the implementation of their child's IEP. So there are a few instances when this is legally required. So I think most of us probably know that it's legally required when a student is classified as a student with autism. But another little known rule is that it's also legally required when a student is placed in a 611, an 811, or a 1213, and that's under part 200.6. So those are the two instances when it's required. You know, we want to be sure that we put that service on the IEP when we're legally required to do so, and you know, for that purpose. I have seen decisions where it's not been on the IEP, but we, you know, not we, but districts have provided, you know, something that had the same purpose as assisting parents in understanding the special needs of their child. Maybe wasn't perhaps called parent counseling and training, or wasn't even on the IEP. And so the SRO found that that was, you know, substantively that they met their requirement. But, you know, we want to avoid being in front of the SRO to begin with. So let's make sure that we know those two instances when it's legally required. Actually, those 4 instances, I should say.
Right. Good stuff. Yeah. All right. So number 14 is me. Okay. This is similar, a little different, but similar to the parent counseling piece. Deals with extended school year services. And it's recognized that students in certain special classes are presumed to be eligible for extended school year services. So we're talking about the same group of kids Andrew referred to before. We're talking about students in 611, 811, and 1213 special classes. That group it is categorized together in the regs in a certain way with respect to extended school year services. So in one section of the regs, it says for a student with a disability to be eligible for extended school year services, you need like evidence of substantial regression during breaks. Okay, we know that. Then in another section, it says those 3 groups of students, kids in those 3 classes, 611, 811, or 1213, shall be eligible for extended school year services I'm paraphrasing, if there's substantial regression shown. But the fact that those 3 groups are categorized together in a separate grouping, to me, I interpret that as they're more likely to exhibit substantial regression. That's why they're in those classes to start with. And so my view, again, this isn't a legal requirement, but the way I view it is we presume those kids are eligible for extended school year services unless the evidence shows to the contrary, that they don't need it. Now, again, I think in most cases, it's pretty clear that those kids are eligible anyway, but I think these are the more severely disabled students that we see through the CSE process. And parents will be upset and surprised and disappointed if we attempt to argue that those students are not entitled to 12 months of special ed services. That's what we see. So that doesn't mean we don't automatically give them ESY, but in those cases where we don't, expect an upset parent, which could lead to litigation, and potentially expect an uphill battle in winning that case. That's just what we've observed over the years. Okay, all right, number 15.
All right, this is a good follow-up to that. And just so all of you know, I am typing some answers to questions that are clarifying questions in the chat, and I'm making them public so you can all see that. We will circle back to some questions as we can as well, but All right, number 15, gather accurate data to determine if students are eligible for extended school year services and share such data with parents. So this is an interesting issue. I find that districts and teachers and service providers are frequently confused about that obligation around collecting substantial regression data. And we collect substantial regression data based on measuring a skill that the student has already mastered. So we don't collect substantial regression data based on their current IEP goals if they have not already mastered those goals. We identify skills that the student has already mastered. We measure the student's mastery of that skill before a school break. And then we measure their mastery of that skill when they return from a school break. And if they've regressed at all, then we measure how long it takes for them to regain that skill after explicit teaching. And so we need to do this through, we can do it over the winter break in December and the February break, the spring break, depending on when the annual review is, to help us identify if the student has demonstrated substantial regression based on how long it takes to reteach. And we can break it down based on SED has a guidance document on how long the typical student takes to relearn already mastered information due to the summer regression. So we know the summer slide, all kids regress over the summer, or just about all kids. And SED has broken down how long it takes students to regain those skills. And we can use that to proportionately determine how long it would take for them to regain the skills for a school break. So if the school break is 14 days, like a lot of you had over Christmas, then we would have more time for them to regain those skills than a shorter break. And we're supposed to consider that data at CSE, at the annual review or a program review to determine if the student meets eligibility for extended school year. And we should arguably collect that data in every area that the student is receiving support. So if they're getting speech and OT, we should collect substantial regression data for those. Academics, we should collect it in all of those areas. And I have seen parents raise the issue of, well, you have no data. How do you know if my child is entitled to this? And that's hard to argue when we truly don't have the data. But in practice, most districts are not collecting substantial regression data for students who maybe don't have more significant disabilities, who maybe only need like a consultant teacher or a resource room. But there's nothing in the law that says that we don't collect regression data for those students. So something to think about. If you know that a parent is interested in extended school year, be sure that your team understands how to collect that regression data and that that's happening.
Yeah,
And if it wasn't clear, if a student demonstrates substantial regression, they would be entitled to extended school year services in the area that they demonstrate that regression. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
right. Yeah, because in theory, if a parent wants, if a parent says my child should get ESY, and you could just show them the data, show me the money. Remember, where's the beef from the Wendy's commercial? This is what we're thinking. This is why this is an individualized assessment, and maybe that works.
Something else that I want to share around this is if the student is entitled to extended school year, that same least restrictive environment analysis applies. So if a student is in a consultant teacher program during the school year, we are not supposed to put them in our 12-on-1 special class that we offer over extended school year. We're supposed to find a general education program with consultant teacher services. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't know of many places or if any where that exists. So something to think about. It's not like extended school year is just a one size fits all and they all go into that program. The continuum and the least restrictive environment considerations apply, but arguably most students in a consultant teacher program are not going to demonstrate substantial regression. If they're able to access the gen ed curriculum, we wouldn't expect that they would have substantial regression, although it's possible.
Right. When that came out, this became a big issue for maybe I don't know if it was 10 years ago or 5. Like this issue kind of boomed because there was a decision somewhere, I think it was an SRO decision or a court decision, saying if you are eligible for ESY, it should be the same LRE ratio, and the reality was those classes did not exist. You know, if you got resource room, a consultant teacher, and you're eligible for ESY, there you don't have a class to send a child. So the guidance from the state was come up with creative solutions like pay for kids to go to day camps and things like that overnight. And it's out there. Remember, it caused a lot of confusion. But yeah, you can get some bizarre outcomes in litigation if you get a claim like that. So, you know, so people, yeah, it's something to think about. All right, number 16.
Okay, tip number 16. Exhaust all potentially appropriate supplementary aids and services before placing a student in a more restrictive setting. This is especially important for students with behavioral needs, but this applies for all students with disabilities. The law explicitly requires that before you move a student to a more restrictive setting, you make sure that you're doing everything you can in that student's current setting to make the setting appropriate for that student. So for example, if we have a student with behavioral needs, then at a minimum, we'll have to do a functional behavior assessment and implement a BIP, right, behavior implementation plan, before we consider moving that student to a more restrictive setting due to the student's behavioral needs.
Yeah, this might be the most important slide in the whole program. This is a huge area of litigation over the years, and we can't emphasize this enough. This is another one where it's legally required. You have to do this. If you don't do this, we're going to lose. But ideally, you do this with input from the parent, and they'll get the buy-in. They'll buy into the student going more restrictive. What we always say is don't rush. So you have a student in a kindergarten class who needs to go to an 811 in district, or an 811 class in district, needs to go to an agency. Parent doesn't want it. You have to really explain to the parent, we tried everything. This isn't working. We've tried everything. And I like this question at the meeting. What else do you think we should do? And you ask them that. And sometimes they'll tell you, they'll say, did you try this? Did you do a BIP? Did you do an outside BIP from an agency? Did you hire a behavior tech? Did you do this? And they'll feel part of the process. Then when that doesn't work, if it doesn't work, they're more likely to say, okay, there's good faith by the district. They can't think of anything else. I can't think of anything else. And we'll have less litigation. Honestly, when we get into litigation for these type of claims, that's what we wind up doing anyway, is saying, well, what did you think we didn't do? And sometimes we just settle by doing that. And if that doesn't work, we eventually, then it simmers down. But you have to do it all. You have to try it all. Case law is clear on it, and get their input on what they think will work.
Yeah, there's no requirement that we agree to everything a parent requests, but when we don't agree, that puts us in a tough position potentially if they were to initiate due process to prove that we did try everything. So I've been in situations where a student might have significant social, emotional, behavioral needs. We know the student needs a specialized out-of-district program, but there is an in-district special class, and the parents want us to try that first before we go out of district. And the district knows that the special class is not appropriate for the student. It's not designed to meet those needs, but it's risky to not at least try it before we go out of district. I'm not saying, none of this is you always have to do it that way, just so you know. Don't walk away thinking that's what we're saying. But if we're not trying what we have available to us in district, or if we're not considering what the parents are asking, it will be more difficult to defend that concept that we did exhaust all potential options. This requires some time and advanced planning. So this is another reason why if a student has significant social, emotional, or behavioral needs, we should consider referring to CSE without delaying too long, because it's always risky when we get to that initial eligibility meeting and classify and say, you know what, we've already done everything we could have tried here in our school. We have to go right to out of district. That's a sign that you waited too long to refer. We really need to have all of those interventions done through an IEP.
Okay, number 17. So this, we couldn't do a tips and suggestions program without talking about declassification. So there's actually the tip is consider the need for additional evaluative data with input from the parent before declassifying the student. This should be well documented throughout the process. So what this means is the rules for declass are written poorly and they cross-reference other sections. And if at first blush, it seems to say that you must do a full reeval before declassifying the student. And on some level, if you do that, that's ideal. But the regs also say that you consider the extent to which you need additional information, evaluative information. So that opens the door for not doing more testing if we're confident that we have enough recent evaluative data. But again, part of that process is input from the parent. So we need to, prior to declassification, ask the parent if he or she wants us to do more evaluations. And if they ever say yes, then we should absolutely do them before making the final decision. So, and we need to document those offers. And I like to have multiple offers. So also, another tip related to this is don't surprise the parent with a declassification. You don't have an annual review meeting and at the end of it say, you know what, I think we're going to declassify the child right now without even putting declass in the meeting. If you're going to do that, you say, you know what, I think we might want to declassify this child, but we're going to have another meeting to do that. So you're putting them on notice, and you say at that annual review, does anyone think we need to do more testing? And you look right in the parent and say, would you like us to do more testing? They say yes, great, we do the testing, we come back for the declass meeting. If they say no, I want to write a letter to the parent after and say, we're considering declassifying. Would you like more testing? And then I'm telling you, I'm so paranoid about this. At the declass meeting, I'm going to say, anybody want more testing? I want that clear and unequivocal, because trust me, at the hearing, they're going to say we didn't test. And I want their buy-in many times. This way, they're not surprised. They don't feel like we're pulling the wool over their eyes. And we're being clear, we're being transparent, but we need to document this, and it's not a surprise to them. Okay. Next tip.
Okay, tip number 18. Schedule CSE meetings well in advance of any applicable deadlines, so there's flexibility to address cancellations and other unforeseen issues. So we know there are certain timelines of when we need to schedule CSE meetings. For example, we have to hold the annual review meeting either on or before the annual review date that's on the student's IEP. So this can require some advanced planning because things come up, right? Parents aren't able to make the meeting. Maybe one of the CSE team members has whatever I have and they're out sick and they have to reschedule. So it's important to give yourself a buffer so that you don't go beyond that deadline. And one way to create that buffer is by scheduling in advance and making sure you're giving yourselves plenty of time to hold the required meetings.
Yeah, I had a question recently that a district's longstanding practices that were inherited over a number of different directors was that as long as the annual review is held within a month of the date, we're good. There's nothing in the law that says that. The annual review date is the date by which we have to hold that meeting, which is why it's a good idea to schedule in advance so that you don't bypass that date. Shall we go to the next one? This one's a really important one. And I'm not just saying that because it's mine. Okay, so tip number 19, recommending home instruction while awaiting placement in an out-of-district program. This is the portion where we call it real talk, just between us, right? So we know that there are not enough programs. There's not enough programs out there. We have kids with significant needs and nowhere to send them, and they're tearing it up in our school, and other parents are complaining, and teachers are threatening to quit or bring grievances or make other complaints, and building administrators don't know what to do. I would venture to say every single one of you has at least one student in your district where that is the situation. And what do we do when that happens? So a lot of CSEs recommend home instruction while awaiting placement because they feel as though there's no other option. There is nothing in the law that says that home instruction while awaiting placement is a permissible thing to do. The only time a CSE is supposed to put a student on home instruction is when the student is too medically fragile to attend school. And home instruction is arguably the most restrictive placement on the continuum, more restrictive even than residential maybe, because at least with residential, they're being educated with other students. So that's also a sign that we should only do that when we've exhausted all potential day program options for a student and all potential residential SED approved residential program options for a student. But even when I share this with some of you, you still feel that you have no choice because it's so significant. We have to place a student on home instruction. That's when we need to start getting creative. So that's when it becomes less about how can we make this program provide a FAPE, because we know it will be very hard if we go to due process to demonstrate that this is a FAPE, that this is a free appropriate public education. It becomes more about how do we avoid the parents initiating due process? Because we know if they initiate due process, we probably can't win. And we also know that this is when parents initiate due process. We have suddenly made their lives very difficult. They have a child who's now home all day. They have to find childcare. It might impact their jobs. So what can we do to avoid that, to make this work as much as possible? It's about getting creative. So how can we beef up these services at home as much as possible? Can we consider busing the student somewhere to receive some of their services, maybe at school or district office or some other place? Can we put a behavior tech in the home for most of the school day so that the student is at least working on skills with a behavior tech in addition to their instruction and related services? How can we get creative so that the parents see that we're working with them? We're trying to give the student as comprehensive of a program as possible. But then on the other side, we have to be very aggressive with trying to find a program. So we need to make sure that we send applications to all potential out-of-district placements, that we stay on top of those applications, that we call, that we check in, that we try to pull favors when we can. And if the response from those out-of-district placements is we don't have room or they reject the student, that's when the CSE, and this is not a great option, but that's when the CSE is supposed to consider SED approved residential placements and start applying to those when we can't find a day program that works for them. Jeff, I'm assuming you have a lot to say. You're muted.
I mean, one tip is just to avoid recommending home instruction, right? I mean, if
Right.
ideally don't do it. But you're right. I think you nailed it. And if you have made that decision, have gone down that road, just, I mean, at that point, the law is kind of out the window because it's not going to be appropriate no matter what. It's working with the parent to avoid a claim. It's damage control. It's getting through the time. It is coming up with things that will make the parent satisfied in the time being. It's very hard. Some parents will insist upon, some parents say, you got to get them in school. You got to get them in a building. Some will say, you got to give them a full day of something. It depends. And then you have to deal with staff.
Yeah, we had a question on that. Is home tutoring awaiting placement a viable option still if parents are not on board with tutoring? It's never really a viable option, and it never was. So it should not be something, we should avoid it at all costs. And then the follow-up is, or can we only set up home tutoring awaiting placement with parental permission? It doesn't really matter if you have parental permission or not. Obviously, if the parent agrees to it, it's less likely they're going to initiate due process. But I have had many cases over the last now almost 11 years where parents have turned on us, where they've said, okay, I'm good on that. And then it carries on for a while and they're not good with it anymore. And they initiate due process. And it is not a valid defense for us to say, but you wanted it, you asked for it. There's actually case law out there that says we still have that independent obligation to recommend an appropriate placement, even if the parent is asking for something that might not be appropriate.
Right. And kind of on this note, with the shortage of programs out at this time, and with this being such a bad option, home instruction, awaiting placement, if you ever have an opportunity to place a student in an out-of-district placement and the parent objects, you should think long and hard about making that recommendation over their objection, because at least you'll have a program to defend. We see oftentimes districts work with the parent, say, fine, I'll give you home instruction. And a few months later, we're very vulnerable because we cannot defend this as appropriate. And we had something and we let it go. So I'm advising more than in the past in those situations to just make the recommendation over the parent's objection, because that's in the district's best interest in the long run.
We have a question. Isn't home instruction an option in the IAES context by parent district agreement? That's different than what we're talking about. So that context is when we go to manifestation for discipline purposes and a connection is found. There is this kind of wacky provision of the regs that say the student, well, this part isn't wacky, the student immediately returns to the placement, but, and here's what's wacky, unless the parent and district agree through the child's BIP to change their placement. And I always think that's weird because BIP doesn't determine placement and IEP does, but that is the circumstance where maybe, I guess you could call an IAES, the parent and district would agree to something different. But I would be careful about doing that long term. I would have the CSE step in and decide what to do next.
Definitely. All right. Tip number 20.
Okay, so all right, leaving a general education student on home instruction for a lengthy period of time without making a CSE referral. So this is sort of a different situation, similarly, similar to the last slide, but we're talking about a gen ed student who's home on, what used to be called homebound instruction, now home hospital instruction. So this is a child find issue. We're seeing a lot. I think many of us are seeing a lot of students, especially post-COVID, unable to come to school for a number of different reasons. But I think the key is here. So if we have a student who is on home instruction, homebound instruction, formerly known as, for a lengthy period of time, that is a sign that we should refer that student to the CSE, or at least we should, at a minimum, consider it. There's nothing in the law really that gives us a clear guideline as to when we should, maybe make that referral. But, we can look to Section 504 as a guide. And what Section 504, instructs us is that anything longer than 6 months is not considered to be temporary. So that's not a hard and fast rule. It may need to be sooner than that, depending on the reason that the student is home and the length of time that they're expected to be home. But we need to keep an eye on those students, because if a student is not coming to school, and then this is a gen ed student, if they're not coming to school, that's a sign that they may need more support. Now, a lot of times what we see is parents, it's sort of a different situation when you have a student who's recommended on home instruction awaiting placement. And in that situation, you have frustrated parents, they want their kid in school. And sometimes it's just the opposite in these cases where we see multiple requests, repeated requests from the parent to keep the student on homebound instruction. That's okay, but we still have our child find obligations. So if we have a student who's in that situation, we at a minimum need to ask for consent to evaluate. And if they say no, they say no. But at least we've done our job and fulfilled our child find obligations, by at least proposing the question. So I don't know if Jeff or Ann or Katie have anything to add, but that's the point here.
Yeah, I think what we see where the problem happens is we're talking about building level home instruction, like where maybe a student without an IEP, let's say they have anxiety or they become immobile or post-surgery, and they go through the school district 30-day procedure for home tutoring. Those kids, and we keep approving them, the building might keep approving them, and the CSE has no idea that this is going on. And then a year passes, and the CSE is totally in the dark. So we really want good coordination between whomever is approving the home instruction, probably at the building level or even the district level, and the CSE. Just as something as simple as, if you approve 4 times in a row, you got to call us, let us know. That's what, because sometimes I've had cases where it's years and nobody tells the CSE.
Yeah, and a lot of mistakes around that are things like, well, the student's very academically capable, so they're making adequate progress in the curriculum. Right, but if they're unable to attend school due to a disability like anxiety or some mental health need or some other need, then, and if it's over a long period of time, that's an indication that there could be an underlying disability and we should refer to CSE. And we all suggest CSE referral and not 504 referral, because 504 is supposed to be implemented in Gen Ed. And when a student's home, they're not in Gen Ed. And we can also do a lot more through CSE to address those needs.
Right. And
we had a
I'm sorry.
We had a question.
The doomsday scenario, if we don't take action with an IEP, is what happens if the parent just places a student in a residential facility and we have no IEP to defend.
And how do we prove that the student is not eligible for an IEP when
Right.
they're out of school because of these significant needs and we've never done an evaluation?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we've approved it based on some medical condition. So it's tough, but it's easy fix. It's an easy fix. Whoever's approving it 4 times is a charm. Just call the CSE director. All right, 2 more to go. All right, so we can do a whole program on this one. Do not refuse to classify a student who displays a need for special ed exclusively due to the parent's failure to produce a medical diagnosis. So the important piece is, we can't put the burden on the parent to get the medical diagnosis if we think the student might actually be disabled. If we have any inkling that the student might be disabled, we probably want a diagnosis to classify. You could always say without a diagnosis, well, you exhibit symptoms or characteristics similar to a diagnosis. But if you're more comfortable with an actual diagnosis, offer to pay for the diagnosis. Tell the parent, if you're not going to get a diagnosis, consent to an evaluation with our medical physician. Ask the parent to go to a doctor and we'll pay for it. Ask the parent, we'll pick a doctor and we'll pay for it. At least we tried. But the worst case scenario is if we say to the parent, oh, you didn't give us a diagnosis, we're done. That's very risky. It's gonna, it legally would be in jeopardy, but from a practical standpoint, it's gonna be off-putting to the parent. Because we're not, with child find, as Ann said before, it's our obligation to get this right. So it might seem unusual, but if we're gonna, again, deny because the parent didn't get us a diagnosis, we need to do something so that we're making a record that we're trying to obtain it. And these are very tough, very unusual cases, but it's an easy fix. And sometimes we help with a letter. We write a letter. We'd say, you haven't given us a medical diagnosis. In order to assess, we want to know if you are in fact or should be diagnosed. So we're going to take matters in our own hands. Please come to our doctor. Please make arrangements and we'll pay, or so on. Get a record on there. And this way, if we refuse to classify, at least we can show that we tried in our evaluation process. But these are tricky situations. And any thoughts on this?
Yeah, we had a question. Can we classify OHI without a diagnosis? And would we just use a behavior rating scale or OT-PT evaluation? You don't need a diagnosis for any of the 13 special education classifications. And you also don't need a diagnosis for 504 eligibility. And it's up to us to conduct an evaluation that assesses in all areas of suspected disability to determine if the student meets classification criteria. And that could include us seeking a diagnosis on our own, either through our school psychologist, or maybe we include a psychiatric evaluation, or with our district medical director, all of that with parent consent, of course. But it's not required to get a diagnosis. It's just required that we collect evaluative information to determine if that classification criteria is met.
Good question.
Can you refuse a 504 if there is no medical diagnosis? No. There is no requirement for a medical diagnosis for 504 eligibility. It's only that a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Nothing about a diagnosis. And it's on us to collect the evaluative information we need to determine if that student has a physical or mental impairment. Now, if the parent shares a diagnosis with us, we should consider it. We might think that's sufficient. Okay, fine, but we can't require it from the parent. The reason for that is our child find obligation to identify, locate, and evaluate all students with suspected disabilities, and our obligation to provide a free, appropriate public education. Requiring parents to give us a diagnosis is not free to them. And those child find and FAPE obligations apply both to CSE and Section 504.
Right. So we're saying, like, there might be situations where we don't need a diagnosis. We know, we're confident the student meets the criteria, and those are, and if we're not confident about that, there is the option of, if you want more medical information to sort of tip the scales, we can't just walk away from the parent saying, hey, parent, give me a diagnosis. If we feel that our decision is based on the existence or absence of a diagnosis, which is shaky grounds to start with, we need to take affirmative action and offer to buy that. That's the thing. So there's sort of two streets here, because back in the day, there were cases where the schools would, parents didn't have access to medical care. The kids were clearly autistic, and they were denied an IEP because the parent didn't submit anything. So we need to go away from that. Okay, the last tip, number 22.
Okay. Regularly remind staff that physical restraints should only be used when less restrictive, positive, proactive interventions have been exhausted. All right, this stems from the rules that, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but relatively new amendments to the regulations regarding timeouts, use of physical restraint. I think just as a parent myself and knowing other parents, I think anytime a teacher is called upon to have to restrain a student, things escalate, there are going to be times when you have to do that, and that will be authorized. But just generally speaking, I think that those circumstances will tend to get a parent's antenna up. Some parents will be understanding, some parents won't. Now, so to reduce the risk that we face a hearing request, we should be regularly reminding staff that SED has sent a very clear signal that this should only be used as a last resort. Now, we have annual training requirements, but it wouldn't hurt to have periodic reminders, or during your staff development days, or your if they're required, professional developments after school here and there, to just briefly remind that this is a last resort. Specifically, physical restraint, if we're going to quote the regulations, is to be used when other less restrictive positive proactive strategies would not prevent imminent danger of serious physical harm. Now, that's sounds like a pretty high standard. Now, obviously, there's going to be times where immediate action is necessary, but to the extent we can reduce the risk or reduce the number and frequency of physical restraints, that will, I think, go a long way to reducing our risk of a complaint. And that's clearly what the regulations want anyway.
All right. Yeah. And, this is we're seeing a lot of claims arising from this issue. Sometimes, some parents are under the impression that we're never allowed to put hands on a student, and which is not consistent with the regs and the law. So sometimes you need to have difficult conversations with parents explaining that, yes, indeed, there are times when this is legally permissible.
Yeah, one
So
other thing,
that's
sorry,
Sure.
Jeff, just to throw in there. So one of the notable changes in that law was, you used to be able to, when it was called an emergency intervention, restrain if they were damaging property. That's no longer the case. You can do it if it's necessary to prevent imminent danger of serious physical harm, but just property in and of itself is not a permissible circumstance. If a student is, punching a wall or punching glass, I mean, I think that could qualify, but it's not just, okay, Johnny is breaking something, we got to stop him. So that's, those reminders will be helpful.
All right. Well, we have now gone through all 22 tips. I think that concludes our review. And were there any questions jumping out at us that you think we might want to address, or?
There were so many good questions. I've been trying to stay on top of them, because I knew we wouldn't be able to get to all of them. You've probably seen me like madly typing over here. There was a declassification question that I thought might be helpful, Jeff. So when declassifying, if the district has already run all evaluations for the programs and services the student receives, what additional testing could be completed? Would we wait to declassify at the reevaluation review if the parent requests IEEs?
Oh, great questions. Well, again, in my view, if we feel we don't need to do any more testing, then that's our position. And we say that to the parent, but we offer the parent the opportunity to give for more testing. So if we don't have to come up with new testing. Obviously, timing's important. If we did a round of testing 2 months ago versus 2 years ago, that would be relevant. And it's case by case. But the important piece is we have to be confident that the student's no longer eligible based on the data we have. The question of an IEE before a declassification, I mean, that's a great question. If I'd be reluctant to declassify with an IEE pending. I just think that it would be it would be too risky. I would just wait. I guess the alternative would be to declassify wait for the IEE results and re-refer. Parent could do that too. But my gut is to slow. To me, I would wait because they clearly have a disagreement with some of our evaluative data. They clearly challenge it, so I would wait if that was me. No. All right. Well, I think we've gone a few minutes over, but thank you everybody for attending our program, our webinar. This was a lot of fun. I want to announce we're going to be doing our next program, live programs in May, special ed update. We are going to be doing live programs May 14th in Rochester and May 15th in Buffalo. These will be in-person programs with access remote as well for those who are unable to join us in person. Save the dates will be coming out soon and topics. Thank you, everybody. Have a safe week. We know everyone's so busy, and if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.